let's dive into 2 Kings. It's a book packed with drama and intrigue, and all these powerful lessons about ancient Israel and Judah, kings, prophets, miracles, you name it. We'll be looking at the consequences of straying from faith, and with the sources you've given me, well, this is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, 2 Kings basically picks up where 1 King's left off. It zeroes in on the reigns of all these different kings, both in Israel and Judah.
Okay, so we're really seeing how their choices play out.
Exactly. And through that, we uncover these profound themes: faith, idolatry, divine judgment, the whole 9 yards.
The book kicks off with a pretty dramatic changing of the guard, right? I mean, Elijah, this towering figure, gets taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Talk about leaving some big shoes to fill for his successor, Elisha.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not just figurative either. Elisha literally inherits Elijah's mantle.
Whoa, literally, like he picks up his clothes.
Yeah. And then he immediately starts performing miracles, many of which, mirror the ones Elijah was famous for.
So it's like a sign, right? God's power is still present, even though Elijah is gone.
Precisely. That continuity of divine power, working through the prophets.
That's reassuring for the people, I bet.
Yeah.
And Elisha's miracles, they are impressive. Purifying poison stew, multiplying food to feed 100 people. The guy was busy. But Elisha's ministry wasn't all about the big flashy miracles, was it? There's the story of the Shunammite woman, a wealthy woman whose faith really stands out.
Yeah, her story's all about resilience, trusting in God. Even when her son dies, she doesn't completely fall apart.
She's remarkably calm, considering.
Right. Instead, she just goes straight to Elisha for help. Like, she just has this unshakable belief in God's ability to intervene.
And what happens? Her son comes back to life. It's like, whoa, talk about the transformative power of faith. Not everyone in 2 Kings gets such happy endings, though, right? There's Naaman, this powerful Syrian general. He comes to Elisha for help with his leprosy. What's so intriguing about his story?
It's the irony of it all, Here's this mighty warrior brought low by this terrible disease.
And he doesn't exactly approach Elisha with humility, does he?
Not at first, no. He's arrogant, skeptical. Can you imagine? He's told to bathe in the Jordan River 7 times to be cured.
Oh, I can only imagine his reaction. The Jordan River. Seriously.
Right. But ultimately, he does humble himself, and of course, he's healed. It really shows that God's power goes beyond any borders or religions.
It's a universal power. That's a powerful message. But then there's this shadow cast over the whole thing with Elisha's servant, Gehazi.
Ah, Gehazi. Driven by greed and deceit, he wants those gifts Naaman offered to Elisha.
And he's willing to lie to get them.
Which has some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah, he ends up with leprosy himself. A pretty stark reminder that valuing material wealth over faith and integrity, well, it can come back to bite you. From here, 2 Kings gets into the nitty-gritty of all these different kings in Israel and Judah. It's fascinating how their actions directly impact their kingdoms.
There's a clear pattern that emerges. Obedience leads to prosperity, and disobedience leads to turmoil.
It's like a cause and effect kind of thing. The kings who followed God's laws, they experienced peace and stability. But the ones who embraced idolatry, not so much.
Right. They led their people down a pretty dark path, full of conflict.
And we see that play out with King Joash, right? He starts out strong, committed to religious reform, even repairs the temple. But
then things take a turn. He lets idolatry creep back in, and his reign ends in tragedy.
It's a reminder that staying faithful, it's a lifelong commitment, not a one-time thing. Then you have King Hezekiah. He stands firm against the Assyrians, trusting in God during a crisis. It's a real David and Goliath story, but on a national scale.
Absolutely. Hezekiah's faith and prayer were crucial in Judah's deliverance. It goes to show that even when all hope seems lost, God can intervene in amazing ways.
If you trust in him, right. But even with Hezekiah's faithfulness, there's this sense of foreboding about Judah's future. Remember when he shows off all the treasures of his kingdom to those Babylonian envoys? Seems innocent enough, but
it wasn't. The prophet Isaiah warns him that this seemingly harmless act will have consequences.
Foreshadowing, right. He predicts that Babylon will eventually conquer Jerusalem and take everything. It's like the seeds of Judah's downfall are being planted, even during this time of revival.
It really makes you think about the complexities of human choices and divine judgment. Even good people can make decisions that have far-reaching consequences.
It's a reminder that our actions have ripple effects. Sometimes those ripples turn into tsunamis. But hey, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot more to unpack in 2 Kings.
Oh, we've just scratched the surface. We still have to delve into the fate of both Israel and Judah and all the timeless lessons we can learn from their triumphs and failures.
Back for more of Two Kings. We've seen how kings and individuals can really shape the destiny of entire nations. Who else jumps out at you from this era in Israelite history?
Well, you got to talk about Jehu. He's this military commander who becomes king of Israel, and let's just say he makes a splash.
I mean, his story is kind of like a political thriller. He orchestrates the death of King Joram of Israel and even King Ahaziah of Judah.
Right. Fulfilling a prophecy against the house of Ahab, no less. It really drives home the point that those in power, they're held accountable for what they do.
Absolutely. No one gets a free pass, especially when it comes to messing with God's plans. And then, of course, there's the unforgettable Queen Jezebel, Ahab's widow. Talk about a dramatic exit.
Thrown from a window and eaten by dogs, just as Elijah had prophesied. It's a chilling reminder that defying God's word has some serious, serious consequences.
Pride before the fall, as they say.
Oh,
But
yeah.
the drama doesn't stop there, right? Over in Judah, we meet Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother.
Oh, Athaliah. She's a classic example of unchecked ambition, grasping for power at any cost. I mean, she even tries to kill her own grandkids to secure the throne.
Wow, talk about ruthless. Thankfully, her reign of terror is cut short. Remember young Joash? He's the rightful heir who's hidden away for 6 years.
It's like a story straight out of a movie, right? His survival represents this tiny spark of hope, this idea that good can prevail even in the darkest times.
And when he finally takes the throne, guided by the priest Jehoiada, he doesn't disappoint. Major religious reforms, repairing the temple, restoring proper worship, Judah gets a much-needed reset.
It's a breath of fresh air, a time of spiritual renewal. But, Two Kings has taught us that these periods of faithfulness, they often don't last.
It's that cycle we keep seeing. It's almost like they're destined to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors.
And sadly, Joash falls into that same trap. Idolatry sneaks back in, and he even orders the death of the prophet Zechariah, who dares to call him out.
What is it with these kings and not being able to take constructive criticism? Why do you think this pattern of obedience and then disobedience keeps happening? Not just in Two Kings, but throughout history, really. It's like a broken record.
Well, it speaks to the human condition, doesn't it? That constant struggle between our desires and God's will. We're so easily tempted. And power, it can corrupt even the best of intentions.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale for all of us. To stay vigilant, keep checking our hearts, our motivations, because it's so easy to get off track. And as we move along in Two Kings, we see more kings in Israel and Judah. And many of them, sadly, keep falling into that same cycle of disobedience, leading to more instability and conflict.
It's all about remembering that covenant with God. He's faithful, but he expects faithfulness in return.
And when they forget that, well, the northern kingdom of Israel ends up falling to the Assyrians. It's the end of the line for them.
A turning point in the story, for sure. Now the focus shifts to the southern kingdom, Judah. And things aren't looking too good for them either, with the Assyrian Empire breathing down their necks.
Enter Hezekiah, a king who seems to get it. He's portrayed as this truly righteous ruler, determined to bring back true worship to Judah. He cleanses the temple, removes idols, even celebrates Passover like never before.
Hezekiah's reign shows what's possible when a nation turns back to God. Spiritual renewal, a glimpse of hope.
But then, the Assyrians, led by King Sennacherib, lay siege to Jerusalem. Talk about a crisis. It looks like game over for Judah.
But Hezekiah, he turns to God. His prayer, it's a model of humility, of complete trust in God's power.
And then boom, a miracle. An angel of the Lord wipes out tons of Assyrian soldiers, forcing Sennacherib to retreat. It's an unbelievable victory, a testament to the power of faith.
The message is clear. No matter how bad things seem, God can intervene if you rely on him. But even with this amazing victory, we see a hint of what's coming for Judah. Hezekiah makes a little slip-up, showing off all his treasures to some Babylonian envoys.
Yeah, it seems harmless, right? But
Prophet Isaiah warns him that this seemingly small act is going to have some big consequences down the road. He predicts Babylon will eventually conquer Jerusalem and take everything.
it's like those seeds of Judah's downfall are still there, lurking beneath the surface, even in this time of revival. It really makes you think, can one person's faith really change the course of a whole nation when everything else, the past, the politics, seem to be stacked against them?
That's a question Two Kings wrestles with. It's about understanding that human choices matter, but so does divine judgment and the flow of history. It's complicated.
It's a tough reality. Even the most sincere efforts to turn back to God, they might not be enough to undo the damage that's been done. As we head into the final chapters of Two Kings, the shadow of Babylon gets bigger and bigger. It feels like a storm's about to break, and all those years of disobedience, they're going to come due. Right back. And it feels like we've reached the climax of two kings, the fall of Jerusalem. It's like everything we've been talking about has been leading up to this moment.
It really is. The consequences of all those choices, that back and forth between sin and redemption, the struggle for obedience, it all comes to a head here in Jerusalem.
We talked about Manasseh, the king who really plunged Judah into idolatry, and how even his repentance couldn't undo all the damage. And then his son, Amon, well, he just doubled down on all the bad stuff. But then we have Josiah. He seems like a bright spot before the storm. Why is his reign so important, especially with what's about to happen?
Josiah's story is pretty remarkable, especially considering he becomes king when he's only 8 years old. But he brings about a huge transformation in Judah.
He really seems to get it, doesn't he?
Yeah. He's driven to wipe out idolatry, to bring the people back to God's covenant. And during this time of religious reform, there's this incredible discovery.
The Book of Law, right? Found during renovations at the temple.
Exactly. Talk about a blast from the past. It's like finding a lost treasure, a blueprint for how they were supposed to live.
You can imagine how impactful that would be, to be reminded of what they'd forgotten, how far they'd strayed.
It was a wake-up call for Josiah and for all of Judah. They realized how much they had messed up.
And Josiah goes all out with the reforms. Idols are destroyed, the temple's cleansed, the Passover celebration is revived. It's like a national reset. Do you think it could have changed their fate? If they just stuck with Josiah's reforms, could they have avoided the fall?
It's an interesting question. Josiah's reforms were definitely sincere. They had a real impact. But Judah's past, all those years of disobedience, it was deeply ingrained.
And then there's the looming threat of Babylon, right? They're like a shadow hanging over everything, getting bigger and bigger.
The geopolitical reality was pretty bleak for Judah. They're stuck between these powerful empires, caught in a struggle they can't win.
And Josiah makes a fateful decision. He challenges the Egyptian army, who are allied with the Babylonians. It's a battle he can't win, and he's killed.
It's such a tragedy. His death really marks the beginning of the end for Judah.
It's like the last light of hope is extinguished. What follows is a series of puppet kings installed by the Babylonians, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin. It's like watching a slow-motion train wreck.
Judah has lost its independence. Their kings are just pawns in a bigger game. And when Jehoiakim decides to rebel against Babylon, well, that's a gamble that doesn't pay off.
It leads to the first siege of Jerusalem. He dies before the city falls, and his son, Jehoiachin, is left to pick up the pieces.
And those pieces are pretty shattered. Jehoiachin ends up surrendering to Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king.
And then comes the exile. Thousands of people, the best and brightest of Judah, are taken to Babylon. It's like the heart is being ripped out of the nation.
This exile, it's a defining moment for the Jewish people. They've lost their homeland, their temple, everything. It shapes their identity, their understanding of God, even in the midst of suffering.
Nebuchadnezzar put Zedekiah on the throne in Judah, another puppet king. Seems like maybe there's a chance to start over, to rebuild.
But Zedekiah listens to the wrong people, advisors who push him to rebel against Babylon.
It's like they haven't learned anything from the past.
He breaks his oath to Nebuchadnezzar, and that's the final straw.
The Babylonians come back with a vengeance, the second siege of Jerusalem, and this time, they don't hold back.
It's brutal, the city's destroyed, the temple's torn down, it's all gone.
And Zedekiah, he tries to escape, but they catch him. He's forced to watch his sons being executed. Then he's blinded and taken to Babylon in chains. Talk about a tragic end.
The fall of Jerusalem, it's a turning point in biblical history. The end of an era for Israel and Judah. It's a fulfillment of all those warnings from the prophets, the ultimate consequence of rejecting God's covenant.
It's hard to read about. It's so devastating. 2 Kings doesn't sugarcoat it. It shows the full horror of what happened.
It's a stark reminder of what happens when you turn away from God. But even with all this destruction, there's a tiny spark of hope. Nebuchadnezzar appoints Gedaliah as governor over the remaining people in Judah. Maybe there's a chance for them to rebuild, to start over.
It's a small glimmer in the darkness. But then, Gedaliah is assassinated. The people, terrified of what might happen next, they run to Egypt. And that's how the story of Israel and Judah ends. It's a pretty somber ending, isn't it? After this deep dive into 2 Kings, what stands out to you the most? It's a book filled with drama, tragedy, but also these glimmers of hope. What stays with you?
For me, it's about the weight of our choices. What we do, individually and as a society, it has consequences. It might not be immediate, but those ripples, they can turn into waves that crash down generations later. It's about that struggle to stay faithful to God, that cycle of sin and repentance, and what happens when we ultimately reject Him.
It's a story that still resonates with us today. It makes us think about our own lives, the choices we make, and the impact they have on the world around us. And even amidst all the darkness, all the loss, there's that reminder that hope is never truly extinguished, as long as we remember where to find it. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dives into 2 Kings. It's been a journey, hasn't it? Full of intrigue, betrayal, faith, and ultimately, destruction.
Yeah, it's a story that stays with you.
We hope you'll continue to reflect on the lessons we've uncovered here. The story of 2 Kings, it might be ancient, but it still has a lot to say about faith, leadership, and the choices we make each and every day. Thanks for joining us.